Dear beloved souls, the ones they called crazy, they're the ones holding the script when the entire show collapses. And you, yes, you were never crazy. You were awake, aware, watching with spiritual clarity while everyone else was hypnotized by applause and performance. Now look at them, wide-eyed, frozen, pretending the fire just started, pretending they didn't hear you screaming from the rooftop, pretending they didn't laugh in your face when you said, "Something's off." So let me ask you this. Have you ever been made to feel wrong just for seeing too clearly, for noticing the shift before the crash? You were the spark they couldn't contain, the truth they couldn't kill, the silence they couldn't silence. They didn't hate you for lying. They hated you because you refused to. You saw the cracks under the paint, the decay behind the smiles, and when you said it out loud, they didn't flinch because you were wrong. They flinched because you were right. Let's get something straight. They were never afraid of you. They were afraid of what you represented. You were living proof that the mask was slipping, that behind the groupthink, the fake peace, and the perfectly staged support, something rotten was festering. You didn't bring the chaos. You just noticed it before anyone else dared admit it. And that made you dangerous. So let me ask again, how many times have you been the first to sense the shift, only to be told you're overreacting? How often have you been the only one watching the exits while everyone else was hypnotized by the clown? While they were entertained, you were preparing. While they were sleeping, you were sharpening. While they were dismissing, you were discerning. And now the cold has come, and they're the ones shivering. Meanwhile, you're standing strong, because your soul never stopped listening. You were chosen, not to fit in, but to fracture the illusion. You didn't come here to be comfortable. You came here to wake people up. But even the chosen grow tired. Even you started asking, why me? Maybe you thought the silence meant you were wrong. Maybe you mistook the isolation as punishment. But you weren't being punished. You were being prepared. You weren't broken. You were being sharpened. And now, look, they're scrambling. They're spinning. They're creating new lies to cover the old ones. But it's too late. You were never meant to blend in. You were built to break the cycle. You are the consequence they never saw coming. And no matter how hard they try to ignore it, they feel you now. So let me thank you deeply for being here, for watching, for listening, for supporting this message. To those of you who've shown love through super thanks, I can't thank you enough. Your support helps spread truth even further. And if you haven't donated, know this: your presence is more than enough. Your attention, your energy, and your spirit mean everything. You are seen, you are valued, you are chosen. Now, if this message is already hitting something in your soul, drop 777 in the comments. That number is no coincidence. It's confirmation. It's your spirit nodding and saying, I knew it. I always knew this day would come. The unraveling, the exposure, the reckoning. This is what you saw coming. This is what they never believed. So stay with me. The world is only just starting to catch up to the truth you've carried for years. The next words won't just be heard, they'll be felt. Let's rip this open, step by step. You ready? Let's begin. God's chosen ones, the community's in shock. You saw it coming before anyone else. Number 1, they called you crazy. Now they're drowning in the smoke of a fire you predicted. Chosen one, do you remember how they laughed? How they rolled their eyes and called you paranoid, delusional, dramatic? You weren't just dismissed, you were ridiculed. They didn't fear your madness, they feared your precision, your clarity, your courage to say aloud what everyone else only whispered in private. And now, the fire you warned them about is burning through everything they trusted, and the smoke is too thick to deny. But you're still standing. Not because you escaped the fire, but because you were built to walk through it. So ask yourself, why do people reject the truth until it's too late to act on it? What makes them more comfortable in ignorance than in preparation? Let's not water this down. They didn't just doubt your instincts, they mocked your vision. They didn't just ignore your warnings, they laughed in your face while you stood, raw with revelation, drenched in the blood of truth, shouting, "It's coming!" And when it came, they acted stunned like nobody ever told them, but you did. You told them repeatedly, not out of ego, but out of love, out of duty, out of a deep knowing that silence would cost them everything. And still, they chose denial. Look around now. The very people who used your discernment as a punchline are frozen in disbelief. Why? Because what's collapsing in front of them is not just a system, it's their illusion of safety. But here's the twist. They're not looking at a ghost, they're looking into a mirror. And it's not you that haunts them, it's what you reflect back. The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty. Proverbs 22:3. You didn't guess, you calculated. You didn't stumble into truth by accident. You followed a trail of spiritual patterns that most people are too distracted to notice. While they were flattering a broken system, you were tracking its limp. While they were seduced by noise, you studied the silence. They hated you not because you were mistaken, but because you were ahead of the curve, because you had the bravery to say what they only dared to admit in their nightmares. Think of Cassandra from Greek mythology. She had the gift of foresight. But no one believed her until Troy burned. And what about Dr. Li Wenliang in 2019? He warned the world about COVID-19 before anyone took it seriously and was silenced for it. Sound familiar? Chosen one, you didn't just see signs, you interpreted them. You were like a general reading the battlefield before the first arrow flew. You held the map, you laid out the strategy, you opened the door to safety, and still, they shut it. Why? Because they weren't interested in truth. They were addicted to comfort. Have you ever warned someone out of love only to be mocked like a fool? Why is it that love wrapped in warning is often the hardest to receive? You were never unstable. You were unshakable. They tried to silence you, label you as too intense, too much, too deep. But what they called too much was exactly what the moment demanded. And now, as the storm rages, they're searching for answers, for refuge. But the truth is, you were the refuge they rejected. Indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. 2 Timothy 3:12. You were the siren in the middle of a sleeping city, the fire alarm no one wanted to hear, and now that everything's burning, they're looking back, finally realizing that the noise they ignored was the only sound that could have saved them. Just like whistleblowers in the corporate world, Edward Snowden, Erin Brockovich, Chelsea Manning, they were all demonized for revealing systems that needed to collapse. And so were you. You threatened comfort. You exposed the cracks. You broke the loop. That's why they feared you. But hear this, your rejection didn't destroy you. It refined you. Every moment of silence sharpened your sword. Every betrayal strengthened your resolve. While they gathered crowds, you gained clarity. While they sought applause, you received insight. And that's why you're dangerous, because you don't need validation to move. You've been called, appointed, commissioned. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:10. You weren't meant to fit in, you were made to pierce through, to slice through illusion, to shake foundations. The universe didn't pick you by accident, it aligned you for this exact hour. When you opened your mouth, the atmosphere shifted. People weren't triggered because you were loud. They were triggered because you were accurate. And that accuracy messed with their illusion of control. Steve Jobs once said, "The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." He too was laughed at, fired from his own company, dismissed as irrational, but his vision redefined global culture. Chosen one, you didn't just survive the fall. You were never meant to fall with them. You held the extinguisher while they lit the match. They toasted their false security while you quietly built your escape route. And now that their system is smoke and ruin, they look to you. Why? Because you were never part of the illusion to begin with. Call to me, and I will answer you and tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know. Jeremiah 33:3. You are the glitch in their godless machine, the storm they couldn't predict, the variable that disrupted their loop, and you owe no apology for that. Because while they were playing pretend, you were preparing for reality. You didn't just see the storm coming, you were the storm. And now the community is in shock, but you're not. Why? Because you already saw the ending. Number 2, they mocked you, now they mimic you. Welcome to the unraveling of their illusion and the rise of your revelation. Chosen one, do you remember when they laughed? Not a soft chuckle, but a dismissive, calculated laugh, meant to shrink you, to make your insight seem absurd. You weren't just ignored, you were scorned. They called you dramatic, unstable, paranoid. They told you to relax, stop thinking so much, and just go with the flow. But the problem was, you weren't built for the flow, you were built for the awakening. And now, the same voices that once mocked you are echoing your language like they invented it. Why is it that people only honor vision after destruction proves it was real? Why must revelation be mocked before it's respected? Let's be honest, they didn't mock you because you were wrong. They mocked you because you were too right, too early, and too unshakable in your clarity. You weren't just ahead of the curve. You were standing alone in the storm before they even noticed the breeze had shifted. While they danced under clear skies, you were tracking the pressure drop. While they toasted the illusion, you were building the ark brick by brick. You were calculating the collapse, sensing the tremble in the foundation, watching every nervous twitch when truth crept too close to their performance. But when you tried to speak up, what did they do? They laughed louder, not because they didn't believe you, but because they did, and it terrified them. Woe to you when everyone speaks well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets. Luke 6:26. Consider Galileo Galilei, condemned by the church for insisting the earth wasn't the center of the universe. For centuries, his truth was blasphemy, until it became science. The same people who crucified his mind later praised his brilliance. Chosen ones always walk that line, mocked first, remembered later. And just like you, when you spoke up, the room shifted, not because you said something ridiculous, but because your words shattered their illusion. You pointed out the cracks, and they called you negative. You exposed the rot in the walls, and they told you to just enjoy the party. But the problem was never your discernment. The problem was their cowardice, their addiction to comfort disguised as denial. Have you ever noticed how silence is rewarded more than honesty? Why do people prefer the illusion of peace over the pain of awakening? You weren't causing drama. You were dismantling the script. You saw the strings behind the puppet show, and when you tried to warn them, they called you unstable. But they weren't laughing because you were ridiculous. They were laughing because you threatened their safety net. Have I now become your enemy by telling you the truth? Galatians 4:16. Just like whistleblowers in history, like Karen Silkwood or Frank Serpico, you weren't trying to destroy the system. You were trying to stop it from destroying everyone else. But here's the hard truth. Chosen one, truth tellers don't get applause. They get crucifixion. First comes exile, then comes the earthquake, and finally comes the echo. Wait, weren't they the one who said this would happen? And now the very people who rolled their eyes when you spoke are whispering your name behind closed doors. Your theories are now their talking points. Your spiritual language has become their aesthetic. The same vibes and frequencies they mocked you for sensing are now plastered across their bios and Instagram posts. But you remember, you were fluent in energy before they could spell alignment. Why do you think they mimic you now? Because mimicry is the disguise of guilt. It's how people pretend to have always known what they once denied. Think of Joan of Arc, a teenage girl who claimed to hear divine voices, who led armies and shifted a nation before being burned at the stake. Later canonized as a saint, but not before being tortured for seeing what others refused to accept. Sound familiar? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Psalm 118, verse 22. Chosen one, you weren't cast out because you were wrong. You were cast out because you were necessary. Every exile refined your fire. Every rejection became your training. While they laughed, you listened. While they ignored the tremors, you studied the earth. The universe wasn't punishing you, it was preparing you. You questioned yourself countless times, wondering if you were broken, but the truth wouldn't leave you alone. The signals kept coming, and you couldn't unsee what you were shown, because being chosen isn't about applause, it's about accuracy, and accuracy is lonely. Nelson Mandela once said, "It always seems impossible until it is done." He spent 27 years in prison, mocked, labeled a radical, before becoming a president and symbol of justice. The system never embraces prophets until their truth becomes profitable. And now, chosen one, you're witnessing the collapse. But unlike them, you're not confused. You're calm, not because it isn't chaotic, but because you were already emotionally prepared. While others are scrambling to make sense of the chaos, you're simply walking through what you foresaw, because when you're chosen, clarity is your curse until it's your crown. For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest, nor is anything secret that will not be known and come to light. Luke 8:17. They now parrot your words like they always believed, but the universe knows. And you do too. They used to say you were too much, too intense, too sensitive. But what they feared was that your depth made their shallowness obvious. So don't shrink, don't tone it down, don't water down your fire because now they're finally catching up. You were never meant to follow the crowd. You were meant to warn them before the wolves arrived dressed like shepherds. This is your moment, not of revenge but of revelation. You don't need credit. You don't need validation. You are the proof. And while they mimic your wisdom now, don't let it make you bitter. Let it confirm what you always knew. You were built differently for a reason. Because the ones who mock first, they follow last. And the ones who doubted your vision, they're now walking inside it, like renters in a house they once mocked you for building. Number 3, they laughed, until the cracks you saw became craters they couldn't avoid. Chosen one, do you remember that laughter? That forced theatrical noise they made when you told the truth too soon. They laughed not because it was funny, but because it was terrifying. Their chuckles weren't rooted in joy. They were shields, desperate reflexes. You weren't just inconvenient, you were disruptive. Your clarity shook the room, not because it was loud, but because it was accurate. And in a world addicted to illusion, accuracy is threatening. Why does the world laugh at the truth teller until reality makes them weep? Why is it easier to mock the messenger than face the message? They didn't mock you because they thought you were a fool. They laughed because they were scared you were right. Every joke at your expense was a defense mechanism. Every eye roll, a silent panic. Because deep down, they knew. You were seeing something they were too afraid to look at. You weren't asking for the spotlight. You didn't stand on a stage. You whispered warnings with trembling lips and steady eyes, and they couldn't take it. They hate the one who reproves in the gate and they abhor him who speaks the truth. Amos 5:10. Think of Harriet Tubman. They said she was delusional, a woman with visions, a woman leading people to freedom through dreams and signs. They called her unstable, but history called her prophetic. She didn't need their approval. She needed courage. And just like you, she knew freedom always sounds like madness to those enslaved to comfort. You weren't trying to break their peace. You were trying to tell them it was never real. You saw the fractures in the foundation while they were busy decorating the ceilings. You saw the rot in the walls while they toasted to illusions. And when you spoke, they branded you dramatic, negative, even dangerous. But when did truth become a threat? When did discernment become something to silence? You weren't born to fit in. You were born to detect, to expose, to speak what others are trained to ignore. And yes, it cost you. It cost you comfort, community, belonging. They didn't just push you away. They tried to erase you. Why? Because clarity doesn't just challenge systems. It threatens identities built inside those systems. And you were the walking earthquake. For we cannot do anything against the truth, but only for the truth. 2 Corinthians 13:8. Think of whistleblower Frances Haugen. She revealed how Facebook's algorithm harmed mental health and democracy. And what did people say? That she had a grudge, that she was exaggerating, but the truth couldn't be silenced, and now her voice has reshaped the conversation around social media ethics. So yes, chosen one, they laughed. But it wasn't amusement. It was fear wearing a smile. It was the nervous tick of someone who knows their world is built on sand and watches you walk with the confidence of someone who has touched rock-solid truth. Every sentence you spoke was a mirror, and they hated their reflection. You said, "This doesn't add up," and they said, "You're paranoid." But the math never lied. You saw the inconsistencies, the contradictions, the whispers behind polished masks. And when you dropped those truths like stones in a silent pond, they panicked, not because you disturbed the peace, but because you exposed it was never peace to begin with. Speak the truth to one another. Render in your gates judgments that are true, and make for peace. Zechariah 8:16. You paid a price for clarity. You sat in silence when the world turned its back. You questioned your own sanity more times than you'll admit. You asked, "Am I seeing too much? Feeling too deeply? Should I numb this insight just to be accepted?" But the universe didn't let you numb it. The discomfort wouldn't let you sleep, because truth doesn't retreat. It wakes, it burns, and it prepares. Think of Alan Turing, the brilliant mathematician who cracked Nazi codes and shortened World War II. The world owes him, but in his time he was mocked, misunderstood, criminalized for his identity. His genius wasn't celebrated until decades after his death. Just like you, he saw too much, too early. And now the laughter has stopped. The fire is no longer distant. It's at their doorstep. The same people who said, "You're too intense," are now quoting your old warnings as if they wrote them. They mimic your language. They echo your vibration. But your silence, it roars. It sits heavy in the room like smoke after the explosion. Because silence from the chosen is not absence, it's confirmation. Why are they only able to honor your clarity after everything collapses? Why do they respect you only when it's too late to stop what you foresaw? The wise store up knowledge, but the mouth of a fool invites ruin. Proverbs 10:14. They told you to quiet down, but your voice wasn't a disturbance, it was a lifeline. They refused it. Now they pay the price. You were mocked, not because you were wrong, but because your truth broke their delusions. You didn't chase clout. You didn't ask for applause. You just couldn't hold your peace in a world collapsing under its own lies. You stood in the storm stripped of approval, alone but not shaken, misunderstood but not mistaken. You were a sword in a room full of plastic forks. And yes, they called you dangerous because you could actually cut through the noise. Look at Malala Yousafzai, shot for speaking truth, mocked for daring to speak about education in a place that silenced girls. Yet she rose. And the same world that tried to silence her now hands her awards. That's the cycle of the chosen. First they mock, then they mimic, then they remember. And you don't even need their validation because you never wanted applause. You wanted awakening. So don't regret the price. Don't grieve the laughter. It wasn't proof of your failure. It was proof of your calling. You were never meant to entertain them. You were meant to alarm them, and alarm them you did. Not with noise, but with clarity. Now, they're the ones flinching, hearing your voice in every siren, every headline, every shaking moment they once swore would never happen. And you're not surprised, because you never needed the laughter. You needed the collapse. And now that it's here, you're still clear, clearer than ever. Number 4, you let them laugh. Now let them sit in the silence that speaks louder than any words ever could. Chosen one, have you noticed how quiet it is now? The same people who used to roll their eyes when you spoke, who made a mockery of your insight, now whisper when you enter the room, not because they're confused, but because they remember. They remember how loudly they laughed. They remember how often they dismissed you, interrupted you, turned your warnings into jokes. And now, that laughter has dissolved into discomfort. The air is heavy. Their silence is haunted. Why? Because the very collapse you tried to prevent has become their reality. But let's ask something deeper. Why is silence more threatening than speech when truth finally arrives? You didn't go silent because you lost. You went silent because you were done. Done trying to convince people addicted to ignorance. Done screaming truth into a void filled with egos. Your silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. It was spiritual warfare executed with precision. You chose stillness, not out of weakness, but as a divine act of trust in timing. Because even the loudest voice is no match for truth on schedule. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Exodus 14:14. Think of Maya Angelou. There were times in her life when she chose silence as her protest. After trauma, after injustice, she fell quiet. Not because she was broken, but because she was absorbing, discerning, storing up power. When she finally spoke, her words changed the world. That's what your silence has done. You didn't retreat. You recalibrated. You didn't run. You recentered. And now your absence speaks louder than any performance could. They called you too intense, too deep, too dramatic. But the truth is, they weren't laughing at you. They were protecting themselves from the mirror you held up to their lives. You weren't attacking. You were awakening. You weren't angry. You were aware. And when awareness threatens illusion, the easiest thing to do is label it madness. Why do people so often label discernment as negativity? What makes awareness so offensive to those who rely on denial? A prudent person foresees danger and takes precautions. The simpleton goes blindly on and suffers the consequences. Proverbs 27:12. You weren't asking for chaos. You weren't craving collapse. You were simply hoping someone would say, "You're not crazy. I see it too." But when that validation didn't come, you didn't fold. You chose the narrow path. The lonely one. The one where the chosen walk when everyone else is too afraid to look truth in the face. That's the cost of clarity. It costs comfort. It costs connection. But in return, it gives you sight sharp enough to pierce through deception. Think of Nikola Tesla. Laughed at, dismissed, undermined. He died in near obscurity, yet his visions of wireless power and frequency-based energy now shape the technology we use every day. He didn't get praise in his lifetime, but his silence echoed into eternity. And so does yours. You chose solitude over safety. You stopped arguing and started observing. You let time become your loudest ally. And now time has delivered your message with chilling precision. Every warning you once gave has returned like thunder. Every moment they mocked is now a mirror they can't escape. Even a fool, when he keeps silent, is considered wise. Proverbs 17:28. Have you noticed how they've changed? The smirks are gone. The sarcasm has dried up. The "you think too much" crowd now thinks a lot. And most of those thoughts are yours. They don't apologize. That would require humility. Instead, they shrink. They avoid your gaze. They sit quietly in the rubble of the lies they clung to while you begged them to wake up. And here's the truth. They didn't just mock you. They needed to mock you, because accepting your vision meant destroying the illusion they built their identity around. You weren't the threat. Your clarity was. They didn't want to change, so they painted you as the problem. Why do people confuse peace with silence and truth with aggression? What does it say about a culture that fears clarity more than collapse? For everything there is a season, a time for every activity under heaven, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak. Ecclesiastes 3:1-7. Consider Rachel Carson, the environmental scientist who wrote Silent Spring. She was ridiculed by industries who profited from pollution. They tried to discredit her completely. But decades later, her work sparked global environmental reform. Her truth was proven, not through debate, but through unfolding consequences. That's exactly what's happened here. You don't need to say, "I told you so." Your silence says it louder. They walk through the ruins of their certainty now, and every broken piece hums with your voice. The same voice they tried to mute, the voice they now try to imitate. They echo your insights like recycled wisdom, as if you hadn't spoken them when they were fresh warnings. And yet, chosen one, you are still standing. Not bitter, not broken, but cleaner, sharper, stronger. You let them joke, you let them smirk. And then you let them walk into the storm without you, because you knew they weren't following truth. They were following comfort. And comfort never lasts. But clarity does. It lingers. It cuts through memory like smoke through a shattered window. What if your silence is the sermon they can't forget? What if your quiet was the confirmation the universe needed to finish what your words started? Set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth. Keep watch over the door of my lips. Psalm 141, verse 3. Some of them now mimic you. Some pretend they always agreed. Others stay quiet, swallowed by shame. But they all feel it. That weight, that shift, that haunting echo. You were the alarm they painted over, the sign they ignored. And now, even your presence unsettles them, because it reminds them of a voice they once tried to laugh away. Being laughed at was temporary, but being proven right, that's eternal. You didn't need to raise your voice, you just needed time. And now time has done what mockery never could. It has crowned your silence with authority. And you walk with it. No need to explain, no need to scream, because chosen ones don't chase applause. They carry prophecy. And prophecy, once fulfilled, doesn't speak. It surrounds. Number 5. You didn't need proof. You felt the rot before it spoke, and that was the proof. Chosen one, let's tell the truth that no one else was willing to say out loud. You didn't need to see it break to know it was broken. You felt the decay in the air long before the structure ever cracked. While they were captivated by charisma and convinced by noise, you were reading the silence. Not the silence that says nothing, but the silence that screams through the space between their words. You knew what was coming, not because someone told you, but because your spirit wouldn't let you unfeel what it already knew. Why do people trust appearances more than they trust energy? Why is it that silence often tells us more than words ever could? They thought the collapse happened overnight. They acted like chaos just descended out of nowhere. But you knew better. You always do. You felt the warmth leave the room months before they noticed the chill. The atmosphere changed. The light felt different. The smiles looked stiff. The laughter was hollow. And no matter how many times they told you to stop overthinking, you knew you weren't thinking at all. You were sensing, interpreting, reading between the lies and decoding the frequency underneath every interaction. But solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. Hebrews 5:14. Just like Sybil Luddington, the young teenage girl who rode twice as far as Paul Revere to warn American troops in the Revolution, no one expected it from her, but she felt the urgency in her bones and moved before the announcement came. That's what makes you different. That's what makes you chosen. While others wait for confirmation, you move with conviction, because you're not led by logic, you're led by vibration. They mistook your awareness for coldness. They called you distant, but you weren't cold, you were discerning. The praise that used to feel warm began to feel mechanical. The eye contact grew just a second too long. The atmosphere, once buzzing with promise, grew stale like it had been holding its breath too long. And even though no one was saying it, you could feel it. Something was dying. Have you ever walked into a room and instantly felt the mood shift, even when everyone was smiling? Why do we dismiss energy when it's the first truth to arrive and the last to leave? For nothing is hidden except to be made manifest, nor is anything secret except to come to light. Mark 4:22. They danced to the same old song, even as the rhythm skipped and glitched, but you heard every beat that didn't land. You caught the tension in the breath, the fear behind the flattery. You weren't imagining it. You were decoding it. You weren't paranoid. You were prophetic. Think of Katherine Johnson, the NASA mathematician whose calculations launched astronauts into orbit. At a time when black women were ignored, she sensed the gaps in flawed systems. She didn't wait for the system to validate her brilliance. She moved through it with accuracy before anyone else understood what she was seeing. That's how you operate too. When you tried to warn them, they brushed it off like static. You're too sensitive. You're just overreacting. But what they didn't know was that your soul had already mourned what was coming. You didn't flinch when it happened because you'd already stood in the ruins alone. You'd already felt the grief. And now that it's finally crumbling, they think you're heartless. No, you're healed. They thought your distance meant disconnection. But in truth, it meant you were done pretending not to feel what was screaming in every atom of the room. You had already moved on energetically. Your silence wasn't emptiness. It was presence. It was a decision. It was a declaration that said, I know what's coming, and I choose to rise above it. The spirit of man is the lamp of the Lord, searching all his innermost parts. Proverbs 20:27. You didn't seek drama. You didn't look for collapse. You didn't crave disaster just to be proven right. You longed for someone to look you in the eye and say, I feel it too. But no one did. And so you walked alone, not in bitterness, but in obedience to what your spirit could no longer deny. Think of Selena Quintanilla. Her gift was pure and her intuition was sharp. She sensed betrayal growing behind closed doors, but kept leading with heart. When the truth surfaced, the world was shocked. But the signs had been there. Her energy had shifted long before the event did. That's the cost of being tuned in. You grieve things while others are still dancing around the fire. Now they call your gut instinct wisdom. Now they ask for your opinion when they used to mock your caution. But it's too late. You've moved. You're already gone, not in distance but in dimension. While they scramble to find safety, you're standing steady, anchored in the clarity you've always had. because chosen ones don't need a headline to confirm what their soul already whispered. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. Matthew 6:22. Why do people wait for proof to validate what their spirit already knows? And why are the ones who listen first always the ones called delusional? You weren't delusional. You were ahead. And the more they denied what you felt, the more at peace you became with walking away. You weren't running. You were evacuating. You don't beg the building to stay up when the foundation is cracking. You move. You ascend. You transition without a need for applause. Now they walk in your wake. They quote your phrases. They mimic your boundaries. They use your once dismissed language like holy text. But you don't need their validation, because you were never trying to be heard. You were trying to stay whole. And that's why you're still intact, because you trusted energy over ego. You moved with the pulse of heaven, not the politics of people. You didn't wait for the storm to arrive. You felt the pressure drop. You didn't wait for the illusion to crash. You sensed the atmosphere dying, and now that everything's fallen apart, they're looking for safety, while you've already built higher ground. You were never too sensitive. You were simply spiritually literate in a room full of emotional illiteracy, and now the silence they once judged has become their classroom. So don't shrink when they come around pretending to understand. Don't feel guilty for knowing before they did, because being chosen means hearing thunder in the sky when everyone else only sees clouds. You didn't flinch because the collapse was never your failure. It was your confirmation. And now that the smoke has cleared, one thing remains true. Energy never lied, and you never needed words to know what your spirit already confirmed. Number 6. They called it loyalty until power shifted and their masks slid off. Chosen one, how many times did they swear they were with you, for life, for purpose, for unity, only to vanish the moment your power didn't benefit their plan? They said it was loyalty. They said it was love. They said it was real. But you saw through it from the start. You felt the shift before the betrayal had a name, and while others were still clapping for the show, you saw the shadow behind the script. So what happens when loyalty is just another costume for control? How do you respond when what looked like family reveals itself as a transaction? What they called loyalty was never anchored in truth. It was proximity to influence, to favor, to perceived gain. And the second the power moved, so did they. Their devotion didn't evolve. It evaporated. The way they turned didn't surprise you. It confirmed what your spirit had been warning for a while, that loyalty without integrity is just strategy in disguise. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for a time of adversity. Proverbs 17:17. You saw it coming. Before the first betrayal, before the first backdoor deal, before the first public silence and private whisper, you saw the switch. It started small, didn't it? A thank you that never came. A favor ignored. A shift in tone when someone more useful entered the room. You saw them bend their morals like currency, trading authenticity for access. And the moment the platform no longer served their brand, they distanced themselves with finesse, with PR smiles, with rehearsed apologies for new directions. They called it growth. You called it what it was. Cowardice in costume. Think of Judas Iscariot. He walked with Jesus, heard the same teachings, witnessed the miracles, yet sold him out for a handful of silver. Was it really loyalty, or was it leverage masquerading as commitment? Judas didn't evolve. He exposed himself, just like the people around you did. Not out of revelation, out of strategy. Have you ever watched someone rebrand betrayal as maturity? What does it reveal about them when their loyalty only lives in seasons of favor? Many will say they are loyal friends, but who can find one who is truly reliable? Proverbs 26. You watched it unfold in slow motion, the dissonance between who they were in private and who they became in public, the praise they gave behind closed doors that disappeared when cameras were on, the missions they once clung to with conviction, now quietly discarded for safer narratives. And when you tried to speak on it, they called you bitter, jealous, negative. But you weren't bitter, you were aware, and awareness in a world of pretenders is always treated like a threat. Think of whistleblower Jeffrey Wigand, the scientist who exposed the truth about tobacco companies. They tried to paint him as unstable, disloyal, but history vindicated him. His loyalty was never to image, it was to truth. Like you, he knew. When silence protects lies, breaking that silence is righteous. You saw their hand long before it moved. While they toasted to brotherhood, you saw the fine print in their glances. You saw how fast family became obsolete when prestige was on the line. They weren't loyal to people, they were loyal to profit. When the benefits dried up, so did their presence. They pivoted, ghosted, repackaged the narrative and left you with echoes. But you didn't retaliate, you didn't launch a campaign, you didn't start a war. Why? Because you knew time would do what arguments couldn't. You chose silence, not as surrender, but as strategy. The integrity of the upright guides them, but the unfaithful are destroyed by their duplicity. Proverbs 11:3. Like Anita Hill, who testified alone against powerful men and was met with mockery, shame, and isolation, only for the truth to rise decades later, reshaping the cultural landscape forever. She didn't scream her truth into the void forever. She spoke it once and let time speak louder. That's what you did. You knew time was the judge, the vindicator, the revealer of all motives. You didn't need revenge. You let the mountain collapse on its own. You watched from a distance as those who once swore loyalty shifted into whoever the highest bidder wanted them to be. Why do people praise loyalty when it serves them, but abandon it when it requires sacrifice? And what does your silence say that your voice no longer needs to? You were called paranoid. Now they call you correct. They say, you saw it all coming, and pretend like they never doubted you. But the truth is, you never needed the applause. You needed the exposure. You needed the masks to fall. And now, they are. Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me. Psalm 41:9. You saw that their commitment was never to truth, but to optics. They smiled in your face while erasing your presence behind your back. They prayed with you while planning their exit. And when they left, they dressed it in words like growth and alignment. But real growth doesn't leave corpses behind. Real loyalty doesn't pivot when it's no longer convenient. It endures. It remembers. Think of Martin Luther King Jr. Many around him began distancing themselves when the heat turned up. He was labeled divisive even by allies. But he stayed. His loyalty wasn't to comfort, it was to conviction. That's what you've done. You stood your ground. While they rebranded themselves into digestible personas, you remained rooted in your truth. And now, the ones they ran to are beginning to see the cracks. The act is slipping. The words are repeating. The fake empathy is growing stale. Patterns are catching up, and their newest masks are already starting to slide. The silence you offered them has become an echo in their new rooms, and they feel it deeply, because the chosen don't throw stones. They let the truth do the talking. You didn't lose them, they lost you, because you're not loyal to convenience, you're loyal to principle. And when the lights go out and the music stops, the ones with convictions are still standing. They don't pivot, they don't perform, they remain. So don't flinch, don't soften your fire to make them more comfortable. Don't bless what betrayed you. You saw it, you felt it, and what you saw was real. You never needed to shout, you just needed to see clearly. And now, As they scramble to rewrite the past, you're writing the future, built on something they could never fake: truth. Number 7. You didn't leave the community. You outgrew the costume party they called purpose. Chosen one, they said you walked away, that you turned your back, that you abandoned something sacred. But let's call it what it was. You didn't leave the tribe. You stepped off a stage built on performance, not principle. What they called unity was just synchronized clapping. What they called community was just collective convenience. And the moment you stopped smiling on cue, you became the threat. So, have you ever been accused of disloyalty by people who were never loyal to truth? Why is it that your silence disrupts more than their constant noise? You sat front row in their gathering for long enough to learn the lines. You saw the script, the forced check-ins, the hashtags of support, the polished group selfies staged to look like spontaneous togetherness. But you knew better, you felt it. The spirit was missing. The words sounded holy, but the vibe felt hollow. You stayed quiet for a season, didn't you? Hoping someone else would say what you sensed, hoping you were wrong, but you weren't. Having a form of godliness but denying its power have nothing to do with such people. 2 Timothy 3:5. You saw what others were too distracted to see. The glitter wasn't gold, it was a filter. The tribe wasn't a family, it was a fan base. What looked like worship was just good branding. And while they built stages and crafted missions, you kept asking, where is the presence? Where is the power? Where is the purpose? You weren't just observing, you were grieving. Grieving the gap between what was promised and what was practiced. You weren't trying to rebel, you were trying to breathe. Because truth doesn't dance to choreography. And your soul couldn't keep clapping for performances that left your spirit starving. How many times have you sat in a room full of people and felt completely alone? Why is spiritual loneliness loudest when surrounded by curated connection? Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Romans 12:9. Think of Lauryn Hill. At the height of her fame, she walked away, not because she lost her gift, but because the music industry tried to manufacture her soul. They called her difficult. She called it deliverance. Like you, she chose authenticity over applause, and that terrified people who had grown addicted to her presence, but not her essence. You stopped posting their slogans. You stopped reacting to their "we should catch up" messages that were really just networking in disguise. You stopped reposting fake affirmations from people who wouldn't pick up the phone unless it came with a tag. And when you did that, when you stopped performing, you became the mirror, and they hated the reflection. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the false prophets. Luke 6:26. You didn't storm out, you didn't curse them, you didn't write a dramatic goodbye. You simply stood up and left the table when you realized the feast was empty and the food was poisoned with ego. And suddenly, they couldn't perform as easily, because you were the soul of the scene, the one who actually meant it, the one who didn't stay for clout, but for conviction. And your absence, it made the lights flicker. They say you changed. No, you just stopped lying. You stopped calling convenience loyalty. You stopped mistaking crowd presence for heart presence. You stopped clapping for people who only supported you when eyes were watching. Think of Fred Hampton. He called out systems that pretended to empower but secretly exploited. He spoke truth that made allies uncomfortable, and though he was assassinated young, his clarity still echoes. You carry that kind of weight. You expose systems that wear the skin of community but live off performance. You are disruptive not because you're destructive, but because you're divinely aligned. Why does authentic presence feel so threatening in a room built on illusion? Why does your peace shake rooms louder than their praise? You didn't change. You returned to yourself. You remembered who you were before the costumes, before the fake agreement, before you were taught to trade peace for participation. You realized it wasn't a tribe, it was a set, and you weren't part of the cast, you were the truth walking through the scene. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. John 4:24. They built a platform, not a people. They mistook the spotlight for love and forgot that real unity isn't curated. It's cultivated, it's tested. It shows up when there's no audience, no likes, no lens. You left not in hate, but in hunger. You loved truth more than you loved applause. You chose silence over being part of the noise machine. Think of Dave Chappelle. He walked away from millions when he saw the machine behind the message. The jokes felt fake. The spirit was off. And though the world called him crazy, time called him correct. That's your story too. You chose stillness over performance. You chose alignment over association. You chose freedom over forced unity. And now they say you're bitter, distant, unstable. But the truth is you're clear enough to recognize the difference between agreement and alignment, between proximity and presence, between tribe and theater. And now they keep dancing, but you walk in truth, in silence, in power, and every step you take away from them unmasks what they built, not because you're malicious, but because your very being exposes what isn't real. Can two walk together except they be agreed? Amos 3:3. You didn't lose a family. You left a fantasy. You didn't abandon community. You exposed a company. And now, as they scramble to keep the production alive, you're building something real, something rooted in alignment, not appearance. They'll call you bitter, confused, unforgiving, but deep down they know the truth. They feel it every time they try to replace your presence and fail. You weren't just another performer. You were the pulse. So stop mourning the mask. Stop second-guessing your departure. You didn't exit out of rebellion. You outgrew the illusion. And the moment you did, you reminded the world that community isn't built on noise. It's built on truth. And you, chosen one, were never meant to play along. You were meant to wake them up, and you did. Number 8, you grew without their permission, and that's when they called it betrayal. Chosen one, the moment you stopped shrinking, they started panicking, not because you harmed them, not because you changed maliciously, but because your evolution made their stagnation impossible to ignore. You didn't become arrogant, you became alive. You didn't abandon them. You abandoned the version of yourself that was silently dying just to be accepted. And now, they can't handle your wings because they got used to your cage. Why is it that the moment you begin honoring your truth, people accuse you of betrayal? Why does your freedom offend those who benefited from your captivity? They didn't love you. They loved your silence. They loved the agreeable, safe, soft version of you, the one who dimmed their light just enough to not eclipse their ego. As long as you kept folding yourself into their story, everything was fine. But the second you found your voice, your vision, your spiritual rhythm, you became too much. But hear this, too much is the exact measure of someone finally becoming whole. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Romans 12:2. Think of Prince. His entire career was a defiance of labels and molds. When record labels tried to control his image and his name, he changed it to a symbol. They called him difficult, rebellious. But really, he was free, just like you. The moment you stopped allowing others to script your story, they couldn't celebrate you. They could only slander what they no longer understood. They'll say you switched up, that you think you're better now. But you didn't evolve out of ego. You evolved out of necessity. Staying the same was suffocating. They won't say that. They'll rewrite the story to make you the villain. Because if they told the truth, that you simply outgrew the mold they made for you, they'd have to face how little they've grown themselves. So they distance, they go quiet, they offer lukewarm hugs and colder eyes. They say, life happened, we're just on different paths, but you feel it, the tension, the absence, the way your presence now feels like confrontation. And the truth is, it is, but not because of hostility. It's because you've become a walking contradiction to everything they've used to stay small. Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? If I was still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. Galatians 1:10. Like Simone Biles, who stepped away from Olympic competition to protect her mental health. Some called her weak, but what she did was powerful. She chose wholeness over applause. That's what you've done. You chose yourself in a world that praised your performance. And now they don't know what to do with you because you're no longer easy to manage. When did standing up for yourself become mistaken for arrogance? Why do people confuse boundaries with betrayal? They didn't leave because you failed. They left because you succeeded at healing, at growing, at becoming someone they could no longer control. The real you, full of boundaries, awareness, and spiritual fire, makes people nervous. And instead of rising with you, they retreated into their comfort. And that's fine, because elevation always requires separation. For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Ephesians 2:10. Think of Chadwick Boseman. He battled in silence, poured truth into every role, every moment, every soul he encountered. His presence was humble, but his strength was undeniable. The world didn't know he was evolving spiritually and physically while still showing up in purpose. And when he left, people finally saw his depth. Just like you, your quiet transformation is unsettling to those who only saw your surface. They loved you only as long as you made them feel safe, safe in their excuses, safe in their patterns. But when you outgrew that version of you, their love turned conditional. Suddenly, they labeled you cold, difficult, changed. But the truth is, you woke up. And once you do, there's no going back to sleep. Why are the people who say you've changed rarely willing to celebrate your healing? What if what they call distance is actually divine alignment? The righteous choose their friends carefully, but the way of the wicked leads them astray. Proverbs 12:26. You didn't switch up. You simply stopped breaking yourself to be palatable. You stopped editing your spirit for people who never intended to read your soul. You stopped apologizing for the volume of your truth. And yes, they'll keep spinning the story. They'll say you flipped, but you didn't flip. You freed yourself. Your growth wasn't a rebellion, it was a resurrection. Think of Frida Kahlo. Her art was bold, uncomfortable, honest. She was called controversial, but what she really did was bleed truth onto canvas in a world that preferred pretty lies. Like you, her expression exposed the pretense of others, and people either backed away or bowed to her bravery. So let them misunderstand you. Let them twist the story. You didn't leave because you hated them. You left because you loved truth more than you feared loneliness. You chose authenticity over acceptance. You chose purpose over peacekeeping. And yes, you're harder to digest now. Good. You were never meant to be consumed. You were meant to be witnessed as a living testimony of what happens when someone stops bending and starts blooming. You are not rebellious. You are reborn. And your evolution does not need permission. It requires space. Space that some people won't give you, so take it anyway, even if that means walking alone, because the narrow path is always traveled by the bold. And you, chosen one, are not just bold, you are called. They'll never forgive you for becoming whole, but you'll never regret it, so keep walking and don't look back. And now, chosen one, as the smoke clears and the masks lay shattered across the floor of your past, one truth rises from the ashes like a banner. You were never wrong for seeing what others refused to face. You weren't paranoid. You weren't dramatic. You weren't too much. You were simply ahead. You moved in truth while the world danced in denial. What they called rebellion was actually revelation. And now, the very people who once questioned your clarity are watching their own world echo the warnings you carried alone. You've paid the price for your discernment. You've walked through seasons where your silence screamed louder than your words. But hear this, the storm didn't break you. It revealed who you've always been. Unshaken, unfiltered, unapologetically aligned with God's purpose. That's why you're still standing. If this message resonated with your soul, if it felt like I was speaking to the very thing you've been trying to explain for years, you're not alone. Share this with another chosen one, someone who's been doubting their voice, someone who's been walking through the wilderness thinking they're crazy, when really they're just called. You never needed validation to be right. You needed time, and time has proven your spirit correct. Now, before we part ways, I want to pause and say from the deepest part of my heart, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, for supporting, for simply existing in alignment with truth in a world that constantly asks you to shrink. To those who have sent your love through a super thanks, thank you beyond words. Every seed you plant helps carry this message further into the hearts of those who need it most. And even if you didn't or couldn't donate, you are just as valued, just as appreciated. Your presence here means more than you know. If you feel led to support and keep this truth alive, feel free to click that super thanks button. But whether you give or not, you are part of something sacred. You're not just an audience. You're a warrior in disguise, a seer, a builder, a breaker of chains. And now, as you rise from the rubble of everything that tried to tame you, I speak this blessing over you. May your discernment deepen. May your path stay clear. May every room you walk into shift in truth and light. And may the very people who doubted you come to depend on the truth you never stopped carrying. Go in power, go in peace, and go in purpose. You are not just chosen, you are necessary.